Welcome. I'm Dr. Simon Kay. I'm Policy Director for the independent think tank Restate. Welcome back for another one in our special series of events called Meetings with Mayors. And our special guest today is the Mayor of Tees Valley, Lord Ben Houchen, who's been kind enough to say that I don't have to say all of that every time. I'm going to call him Ben from now on, unless the formality has to resume for some reason. Hopefully, I won't cross any lines. First of all, a very quick word about our work before we get started with the main event here. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm the person who leads on Restate's big program of work called Reimagining the Local State. This is a project to explore the case for deeper, more radical, more foundational change, not only to the system of local government across England and local public services, but also to think about that relationship with central government and with communities as well. So we take in policy on devolution, local government reform, communities policy across all of England. And if you're interested in our work or you want to learn more, do please get in touch. Now, Meetings with Mayors is our big flagship event series for that program. And the aim of the program, of the events, is to organize a proper chat, a proper conversation with every directly elected regional mayor in England. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty clear because mayors are something new to our system. They're directly elected, they have clear personal mandates and a different source of legitimacy when compared to the way that politicians in other parts of our system operate. But that legitimacy, that direct personal mandate, also comes within the terms of reference, within the structures, within the limitations of a very over-centralized country, something we talk about an awful lot on our program, Reimagining the Local State. So how does that work? How do you, when that unstoppable force of a strong personal direct mandate hits the buffers on the edges of the lanes of an extremely over-centralized system and a quite controlling central government, how does that system operate? That's sort of the heart of what we're trying to investigate here. So in this series, we're getting to know the mayors who've been asked to take on more and more powers, more and more responsibilities. And we're exploring what this new form of governance means for our country and for all of our places. So we do have the audience joining us live for today's event. I can still see some numbers ticking up there. We'll be sharing it as a video and a podcast in the near future. Please do use the Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of your screen there, you'll see a Q&A button. If you use that, you can write in any questions that occur to you while we're speaking. And then around the second half of our conversation, I'll start using those to weave into the chat we're having. But look, that's more than enough preamble from me. Let's get started with Mayor Houchen with Ben. Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So we try to start these events with the same questions each time, and a question that goes to sort of your motivation. Being a mayor, as I've just said, is a very different sort of role. There are lots of different ways into politics, into governance. So what made you want to become a mayor in the first place, and what made you want to be Mayor of Tees Valley in the specific case?
I suppose my answer might be slightly different to other people because anybody that's kind of researched my journey since the election in 2017, as I was elected alongside, I think there's only me, Andy Burnham, and Steve Rotherham left from the original intake in 2017. It's probably fair to say that I was accidentally elected in 2017. The deal for the Tees Valley was quite a late one, so it ended up being confirmed in the December of 2016, just a few months before the election was due to take place. And it was part of the first round of all mayoral deals. So there was a huge issue of public awareness. What is a mayor? Why would we vote? Turnout, obviously still a consideration today. And I, at the time, was the leader of the opposition on Stockton Council. I'd been a councillor for what would be nearly 6 years at the time, just over 6 years. I was running my own business, and a very close friend of mine who was the former MP for what was Stockton South, James Wharton, was the Northern Powerhouse Minister at the time. So he was the one responsible for working with George Osborne, going around the countries, negotiating with areas to try and deliver devolution deals. So interestingly for us, one, we were never originally intended to have a devolution deal as part of Wave 1. A couple of things happened. One, James Wharton ended up becoming the Northern Powerhouse Minister, and so was obviously keen to push his local area for a devolution deal. And the other thing that happened in the run up to the devolution settlements that were agreed was the closure of the Redcar Steelworks in 2015. And then post the closure of the 2015 steelworks, Michael Heseltine was appointed by the government as an advisor to produce a report called Tees Valley Unlimited about how we could reimagine. Well, actually, it was supposed to be the steelworks, but he, in typical Heseltine fashion, decided to do a regional report. And obviously, he recommended things like development corporations and that we should be part of the first wave of devolution. So it was an accident to some extent that we got a deal. And again, this is no secret. James has talked about this previously, where he actually approached George Osborne about a deal for the Tees Valley. And George, in a nice way, kind of said to him, look, I've got more important things to do. We're still trying to get the Manchester deal over the line, which is obviously the blueprint at the time for the future of devolution. Happy for you to try, but we're going to leave you to it. And if you can get them to agree, then we'll do it. But we're going to let you negotiate that one, James, and see how you get on. So, like I say, we were never intended to have one, so we were quite lucky to get that. I think the stars aligned, circumstances aligned that meant that we were able to do that. And then secondly, James approached me in the same December, asking me if I'd be the local candidate, probably as next to him, probably one of the more high-profile local Conservative politicians in the area at the time. And I remember the words out of his mouth saying, don't worry, Ben, you're not going to win. We'll have a bit of fun. Labour are obviously going to win, but we'll use it as a stepping stone towards the next general election. We'll have some fun with them. We'll give them a black eye, and then you can go back to being a councillor, running your own business, and we'll all get on with our lives. And I actually remember telling my wife, I remember where I was when I said, oh, I'm thinking about standing for mayor. And she said, well, you're not going to win, are you? I said, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to win. And she said, oh, that's fine then. Don't worry about it. You can do it. So yeah, I was, again, to give you an idea, back in 2017, obviously every single constituency of the 8 constituencies except for one was Labour. You had people like, obviously not in 2017, but Peter Mandelson, Tony Blair, Mo Molan were all MPs in the local area previously. Every single council was Labour. So Ladbrokes had me at 200 to 1 to win. And then I ended up sneaking in and winning. So it was a complete accident for a lot of different reasons. That's not to say I didn't want to be mayor. I mean, one of the reasons James did actually convince me to stand is because, why wouldn't you put your name forward for a significant role, even though I didn't necessarily think at the time I was going to win, particularly for an area where I was born and raised. I mean, other than a hiatus to university in 2005 to go to Newcastle for 4 years, I've lived in Teesside my whole life. So, yeah, an alignment to the stars. And when I was elected, we just took that opportunity and we ran with it. And you look back and 8 years have disappeared and you wonder how you ever got here.
I think that aligns with something I think I've heard you say in public before, which is that you've spent, apart from you described it as a hiatus, but apart from that patch of time in Newcastle, you've been in the same area in Tees Valley your whole career. I think you said recently that you always will be, but there have to be some people in your ear saying, "Come on, there's a whole world down in Westminster as well. Conservative Party might need someone like you." Are you hearing those sorts of whispers? Is there any appeal to national politics, having been a mayor?
Um, I mean, to be frank, yeah, I do. I get it. I get it a lot from local colleagues, national colleagues, people in the press, other people, and I think there's a huge assumption that that will happen at some point in the future. I can honestly say I haven't made a decision on that. I think there's also an interesting barrier that I face compared to most. Not only well, actually, I could, in theory, be mayor and MP at the same time, albeit the new devolution bill is excluding that. So, for a very small window, you could straddle the two. So that becomes less practical. But then you also face the issue of being in the House of Lords, and obviously, you can't sit in the House of Commons and be a member of the House of Lords. And as far as I'm aware, I have been told, and somebody can fact check me on this, Simon, maybe you know the answer, but I've been told that nobody's ever resigned a life peerage before. There have been some hereditaries that I think have resigned, but I'm told that hasn't happened before. So, it would be a big thing to do. Who knows? The other thing I say, and this sounds like a very typical politician's answer, I'm going to be mayor for another 3 years at least, because that's what the term is. The general election is not going to be for probably 3, if not 4 years. And a lot can happen in 3 years. I remember, what are we now, 2025? It was only a short while ago that we had Boris Johnson in power, a massive majority, and we were going to govern for the next 20 years. And and Labour got elected on a landslide last year, and look at the mess that they're in. I mean, politics is such a volatile thing at the minute. I think it would be wrong of me to try and plan out my life for the next 10 or 15 years when there's a lot of water to flow under that bridge.
So that's an interesting answer, and I think it'll. What would be interesting about that would be not only from your time previously as a councillor to mayor, but then perhaps in future when you think about the life of an MP, the way an MP represents and is elected. I mean, you just described your original election as sort of getting elected by accident. No one really expected it to happen. 2021, that was a bit different, wasn't it? You got re-elected, I think arguably with the single biggest personal electoral mandate of anyone in the country. 75, nearly three quarters of the vote, 33% swing election to election, boost to turnout. I think you beat the next candidate by more than 40%. That personal mandate and that direct relationship with voters, that's very different from being a councillor, very different from being an MP, isn't it?
It is. It's
What's
hugely.
your reflection on that?
It is hugely different. I mean, the incumbency of a mayor is a number of times more significant than an MP. So I appreciate most people on listening to this and watching will know this. But if you're a good local MP, I've always worked historically being involved in politics that you could add. I mean, if you're really lucky, you might get 4 or 5%, which you can say is a personal mandate of the people you've helped over a 4 or 5 year period in that parliament. And you could be extremely high profile. You might be a junior minister that gives you more profile. So there are around the edges where it's a close election, a local MP has a swing towards them that can be anywhere, like I say, between 2 and 5%, really. I think that's probably sensible. I think where you have a very present, very active and successful mayor of any colour, I think the incumbency is a number of factor of times bigger than that. It's at least double. It's at least double. And so I think where you have strong mayors that deliver and have a good reputation, it's extreme, irrespective, not all the time, because ultimately when the tide goes out, the tide goes out. But within reason, it's very, very difficult to dislodge a mayor, irrespective of their political colour. And I think, to be fair, my election this time around in 2024 was a demonstration of that. I mean, it was just a few weeks before the general election where we were obviously, as a Conservative Party, completely wiped out, basically. And I still managed to get the third highest share of the vote of any mayor in the country, with more than, well, I think it was more than 50% of the vote. So, yeah, and that is the testament to my team and the hard work we do locally. And obviously, there is some element of that which is a Conservative vote, but I think it's fair to say a large element is that personal vote, because people see you as when you're elected as a mayor, they see you as the mayor first, a politician second, and I think a party man third. There are so many people that voted for me say, "Oh, yeah, he's a Tory, but I'm still going to vote for him." So it's almost like they'll vote for me despite of the Conservative Party rather than because of it. And they see the mayor as a titular leader of the area. They see it a slightly different way as they do to a local MP. They don't see it as political. They see it as more local. And then if you frame your mayoral term as a very kind of ultra local priority, high profile campaign, then it can take you a long way.
I'm interested in the kind of the twist in the tail here as well, though, of course, which is that, and I'm sure this is something you'll have given thought to, but the turnout for these mayoral elections just seems to be so stubbornly low, doesn't it? And I know lots of people. I mean, in the people I have conversations with, but I myself, I think it's slightly baffling. Like you just described, you are probably the most visible, highest profile, easiest name recognition figure in your patch. Certainly, Andy Burnham is in his. We have this plethora of really active, visible mayors now across the country, and it's a growing number. But turnout seems to be hovering around that 30% mark, as it is for local elections more generally. What do you think explains that? And what's going to make the difference? How are we going to shift the game a little bit in terms of people engaging with and deepening that legitimacy we were just talking about?
Yeah, and I think we see similar turnouts, okay, maybe ever so slightly higher, but not much higher in London as well, which you'd think, is in effect a bit of a pseudo-national election, despite it being about the London mayoralty. And you find that it's stubbornly low. I think I've always believed that where people see that a locally directly elected leader has a direct impact on their life, that they can kind of feel and see and touch, and they recognize that person's responsible, then over time it will drive more turnout. And a lot of the surveys that we do, and we've done them both with Teesside University and Northumbria University now, on perceptions of the role, profile of the role, do you understand who those people are, etc. You find where you do that, that translates better into turnout. I think you see that in Teesside, even compared to some of the other mayoralities, because of that, because we are more high profile. And I also think we've always done what we said we were going to do. We've done things that are tangible to people's lives, and so people feel slightly more engaged with it. Having said that, you're right. I think our turnout was 31, 32%, so still stubbornly low. But you really get into quite a technical, I think, discussion there about it's still difficult to communicate to the public what the regional mayors are actually responsible for. There's a lot of overlap with local government. And we could have a really detailed discussion where actually, if you understand it, there's not a huge amount of overlap. But to the average person that isn't interested in politics, Ben, why aren't you getting our potholes sorted out? Why aren't you sorting out empty my bins? And you've got to be very clear about, well, that's not the responsibility of the mayor, it's the responsibility of the council. That creates a bit of confusion. It actually creates a little bit of frustration as well, because people kind of say, well, it's not clear who I'm supposed to go to and who's responsible for the things that interact with my life on a regular basis. So there's got to be a way of, I think, clarifying that. And I also think that's, I know, probably lurching Simon into what you want to talk about going forward, but that's the worry I have with devolution going forward, about the clear lines of demarcation, both with local government and central government, where if you are not crystal clear with the voter and you blur the lines, it can create either disillusionment or disengagement, irrespective of how well performing that mayor or combined authority area is.
Let's jump into that right now, since it's such a perfect opening for that part of the discussion. I mean, so one of the big themes in the conversations I've had with your fellow mayors as part of this series is the, can I call it, mission creep effect? Because you're visible, because people know your name, because they vote for you directly, you're seen not only as the leader of a combined authority, a specific kind of institution with a specific remit, but as you've just said, you're someone who's kind of expected to have something to say about everything that's going on, from national trends and politics, which I think you're called upon to commentate pretty frequently, to, yeah, well, what's going on with this pothole at the end of my road, or come on, sort out the bins, or whatever it is that the constituent local authorities ought to be directly responsible for. And I guess my instinct is that over time, that mission creep will become real. That actually someone in your position will probably have to have an institution that can say something and can take intervention measures in all of these different aspects of local governance. But is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's a fork in the roads for the future of devolution, to be honest. And I think we're getting there quite quickly. I don't think the devolution bill that's going through Parliament at the minute quite gets there. But I think what the next iteration of devolution will be, I think, has to deal with the strategic question of what do they want devolution to be like. So interestingly enough, I take a very different view to devolution than, I think, I don't want to speak for Andrea Jenkins, Luke Campbell, or even Paul Bristow in Cambridge and Peterborough, because they're relatively new. But let's say everybody else, which is basically the Labour lot, right? So Labour takes a very different view to me. That's not because it's a Labour position, actually. It's just a different view of devolution. I am very strongly of the opinion that devolution, regional mayoral devolution, should remain very focused and very narrow. I mean, fundamentally, to oversimplify, we are directly elected and directly accountable regional development agencies that cover the geography of our area. We don't deliver services by and large, but again, you're seeing already some mayors kind of trying to move into that service area. But fundamentally, from a hard power point of view, we don't deal with services, we're not emptying bins, we're not doing potholes, we're not doing children and adult social services, etc., etc., etc. And I say one of the reasons actually most combined authorities have been actually very successful compared to most of the local government bodies is because we have a very narrow remit of what we're there to do. It's economic growth. We're there to bring investment, create jobs, put more money in people's pockets to look after themselves and their families. And we do that by attracting investment. And therefore, we're responsible by and large, again, to oversimplify, we are responsible for things that are linked to economic growth. So skills, transport, etc., etc. I think you've got to be very careful at broadening that horizon. I think what government should be doing is deepening those powers. So passing over more powers that give us even more control and more depth of those existing powers. And there's plenty they could do. Planning actually is a good example of that. And I think there are other things, but planning actually is a really positive step forward. So I think we should be going that direction. What a lot of the other mayors say is, and I get that, there's a logical argument for this, but this is the mission creep bit, right? It's, well, okay, if we're going to have an effect over the economy, we need to make sure people can work. And for people to work, we've got to have an effect on health outcomes. So we want responsible for local health. Right, okay. And if we're gonna make sure that we're getting economic growth, we need to make sure this is a safe environment. So I also want responsibility for the police. And by the way, if there's arson and people aren't going to invest, I need responsibility over fire. And by the way, if we're going to get investment, I need actual functions from government over international investment. And all of a sudden, you create another blob. And I don't approach that saying that that logic is wrong. There is a logic there that you can understand why somebody would want to put their arms around all of that to say, well, I as an individual, if I can control all of these things, then I can make it all right. I just use my personal experience of public bodies, and where they have too many responsibilities and a broad responsibility over a vast area, you tend to find that the culture of those organizations become, to be honest, a bit flabby. People within those organizations don't actually know what the goal of that organization is. You know, if you go into our organization, okay, we're only small, right? We employ maybe 150 people in total. But if you went out into this organization, you said, what are we here to do? People would tell you, we're here to bring investment, to create jobs, to make people's lives better. You know, they wouldn't talk, and we've done it on purpose. We wouldn't talk about health. We wouldn't talk about policing. We'd keep that narrow. And we might edge into that ever so slightly, but we try and keep that very narrow remit. And I think you get, because public sector doesn't have that profit motive, it doesn't have something that is a shining star and a guiding light for it. Operational significance and cultural significance of what that organization is there to deliver is crucial to, I think, good services in the public sector. So that's why I steer away from having more powers, because I just think that makes the public sector body inefficient. Keeping it narrow keeps us what we're doing, keeps us efficient, and keeps mayors actually being relatively popular to other politicians, because people can see a cause and effect with electing somebody.
I think that's such a fascinating answer, and speaks to what I agree is turning into kind of the big debate point for this next generation of devolution that's coming up. And who knows which way the system will jump. And like I think you've implied, there's a political kind of side to the question as well. But let me try something on you then. I mean, you've mentioned, yeah, okay, there's a kind of a everything theory of everything, where if you care about economic growth, you have to care about all of the variables that contribute to economic growth, from public health through to whatever else. Well, we can be more focused than that and also be really ambitious about devolution in this country. For example, fiscal devolution. There's, I think, a pretty clear-cut case that if you were able to set some tax policy, you would actually be able to enhance your growth pursuit efforts in a pretty significant way that you're not. That's a lever you just aren't able to do right now. It's just in the hands of the Chancellor at the centre of the country. So you're nodding. I think that means that you're on board with that idea. But then I think you're back into your chain, right? You get fiscal devolution. That means you're a budget holder in a different way to what you are now. If you're a budget holder, that means maybe the combined authority, the regional authority, becomes the thing that has discourse with the constituent authorities and has to pass on out funds down to them in a slightly different way. And before you know it, you're a big fat tier of government again, full fat governance tier. So I think that's the tension that I'm really grappling with in the work we're doing here as well.
But that's, I think, why the next conversation about devolution can't just be what set of powers do mayors want. It's what do we actually want devolution to look like in 15, 20 years' time? Nobody can actually answer that question yet. We're all kind of feeling our way through. The first phase of devolution, which was George Osborne obviously setting it up, it obviously got the ball rolling. We've not really had a significant step in devolution since then. There's been a few bits around the edges. And like you say, you've had, again, good on him. I actually agree with the campaign. You can just make an argument whether it's a devolution issue. But, Andy Burnham wanting, control of a taxi licensing feels very micromanagement, feels too down in the weeds for what a mayor should do, and moves away from that economic story. Again, in principle, agree with the policy. The question is, does it lie in devolution? I think what we've got to decide, and actually all of the waffle I've just given you actually on the previous answer, the starting question has to be, not just is it narrow or is it wide, what do you want the public body to do? It's, are we going to go for fiscal devolution or not? Because really, I personally don't believe devolution is mature devolution until you have fiscal devolution, because you have some responsibility. We do have responsibility, and I get blamed for an awful lot. And, I'm big enough and stupid enough, I got myself into it. I'll take that on the chin. But until you have the economic levers to be able to pull, where the decisions you make have a financial consequence for either positively or negatively, or it's raising taxes or it's able to reduce taxes, then you can't have mature devolution. What we can't have at the minute, what I think we have a little bit at the minute, is a little bit of kind of Goldilocks syndrome in devolution, because when things go well, it's always, look at what the mayor's done, look what I've done, aren't I great, I've delivered A, B, and C. When reality, all of the funds, with the exception obviously of some of the levies that some mayors raise, comes from central government entirely. And so you would make an argument, well, you're only delivering that because you're doing it in conjunction with government, because even with government money, a lot of it isn't just devolved. You've got to go back to government and get approval for what you spend it on, etc. Even within the Trailblazer deals, that's true. So that's not actual autonomy to be able to move budgets around. And when things go wrong, it's government's fault. They didn't give us enough money, or they didn't give us permission to do this, and it's their fault because they didn't do A, B, and C. It's like, well, you know what the rules of the game are. You know what you've got to play with financially, and so until you can say, right, I'm going to introduce this policy, and to do it, this is how it's going to be funded. It's not government's fault. It's our decision, and then I have to justify why I'm raising your taxes. So one of the examples we get locally, we're obviously being pushed, particularly by the local Labour Party, to franchise buses. Obviously that's a national policy. All the other Labour mayors are in the process of having franchised in Andy Burnham's case or going through that process. I think, just basically turn around to people and say, if somebody can present me a financial case that shows that it doesn't cost the local taxpayer a fortune, then I have no ideological principle against the franchising of buses. I just know that it's going to cost local taxpayers a fortune. And one of the principles that one of the manifesto promises I made in 2017 and have stuck to ever since, is I promise that I will never raise a single penny of taxes on local people. I will never put a transport or a mayoral levy on anything. So that, to be fair, we've put ourselves in some handcuffs there in that we're not creating a revenue stream to be able to move into that type of service. But to be fair, even if we did, it might raise 10 or 20 million quid a year to be able to, in revenue, to be able to move into some of these services. But just take a look at what's going on in Manchester. It's costing in revenue terms, both through government subsidy directly and local levies that Andy Burnham is raising, £250 million a year to subsidise franchise buses. And all of the risk, 100% of the risk, is levied on the taxpayer. The operators don't take any risk. They're putting on buses, they have a contract, and they get paid whether somebody's on it or not. It's the local taxpayer that's being funded via local precepts that the mayor's putting on, or they're getting subsidy through the what's called the Bus Service Improvement Programme, which is basically government subsidy to do it. £250 million a year. Now, I don't think that's sensible, because I think there are other things we could spend £250 million a year on that would be better used to be able to improve people's lives. But until you have that fiscal responsibility, where otherwise you're a bit, again, not just a Goldilocks, you're a bit of a Santa Claus mayor, where you're just handing things out, but nobody's responsible for how it's being paid for. And then we're in a situation nationally, obviously, where finances are tough, so that when things go wrong and mayors don't get what they want, or they don't get that revenue stream from central government, all of a sudden it's government's fault. But government don't have control over the policy that you're trying to implement. So I honestly don't. I think there is a real risk at some point in the future that a political party, it could be Reform, it could be the Tories, it could be anybody. Labour might change their mind on mayors. Devolution is not set in stone at the minute. The way you do set it in stone is taking a decision over fiscal devolution. What that looks like, we can get into the detail of. But until you have that, it's not real devolution. It's kind of playing at devolution to some extent. And I say that as a mayor who's been around for, 8-9 years now.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a fascinating place to land that point, because if you're playing at devolution and your stated central ambition is to achieve greater levels of economic growth, economic activity in your patch, well, you've just listed off your constraints and your limits, right? No fiscal devolution. You've made the decision you don't want to have a big fat precept helping you to get things sorted out. There's all sorts of political constraints. We can talk about those in a minute, because you're in an area where you've got to kind of transcend those political boundaries in order to get quite a lot of things done. There's lots of stuff, but I mean, looking at the figures, I've seen statistics like 9% real terms growth across Tees Valley since 2014, estimates of more than £1.5 billion of value added through what the Combined Authority specifically is doing. There's a lot of economic growth happening with the very limited tool set that you currently have. So I wanted to hear a reflection on that. And I think we'd also be remiss not to talk about, for example, Tees Works, right? Where the trade-off between achieving higher levels of growth with your limited tool set and some of the guardrails that surround the spending of public money. A lot of people will have seen that. I mean, there was an investigation that concluded there was no evidence of corruption and so on. But there's clearly some kind of tension here, or I'd love to hear your reflection on this, between achieving growth with the limited tool set available to a mayor and the guardrails and expectations and public transparency expectations that surround the spending of public money. What's your thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose for people who, again, get into the intricacies of combined authorities, the accountability for combined authorities, which again goes to a fiscal devolution argument, is that we have an assurance framework that we report via MHCLG, but ultimately we also have a 5-yearly gateway review with the Treasury. And we have to account for making sure that we spend public money appropriately. And there's a value for money argument for that. There's a BCR argument for that. We have outcomes that we try to achieve, and government will come on an annual basis on a kind of a light touch, in a light touch fashion. Every 5 years, they'll do a real deep dive into that. And in theory, if you fail your 5-year gateway review, government will pull your funding. So there are significant safeguards there, and oversight from central government is not insignificant. So if you take Teesworks, for example, and some of the frank nonsense that led to some of the nonsense investigations, which obviously have come out as we expected, that there was nothing to see there. What often gets lost in the noise is before anything was done on Teesworks, we got not just agreement from the 5 local authorities, so they approved everything that we did. We also got agreement for MHCLG, from Bays at the time, and from the Treasury. I think it ended up actually being signed off by the Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Treasury and the Exchequer Secretary for the deal that we did. So the huge oversight that goes in behind the scenes actually was all there and still is there. And actually only last month, since we took control of the site in 2020, we had to report directly to Treasury, not even into a department. We had to report directly into Treasury on a monthly basis, in advance and in arrears, on what we were spending on, why we were spending it, and the outcomes of that spending. So what you often find being reported is not necessarily true, which is why you have an investigation and you realize all of a sudden civil servants and actually senior politicians have been all over this for a long, long time. The approach that I take, because of the constraints I put on myself around raising local taxation, I think aren't as onerous as you kind of lay out, because I think there are more fundamental problems with the place like Teesside than having to get into running services. And so I suppose this takes me back to the beginning, Simon, of having been born and raised here and basically lived here my whole life. I know exactly what the problems are with Teesside. It's not a perfect place, and there are significant pockets of deprivation. There was actually a Panorama documentary on this a couple of years ago. The disparity in life expectancy between Yarm, a place in Stockton, and Billingham, also in Stockton Council area, which is less than 15 miles apart, is the largest differential in life expectancy in the whole of the country. You're talking in Yarm, it could be into the mid 80s. And in places in Billingham, you're into kind of 60, 65 territory. So there are huge challenges that we face. Why do we face those challenges? Well, to be frank, it's one of the reasons I'm also a conservative. The local politics of Teesside has shaped me. We haven't had investment into Teesside, to be frank, actually by any government, going back 40, 50 years, if not longer. The local economy peaked in the 1960s with British Steel and ICI. Both of those two companies alone employed over 100,000 people, and in the supply chain of the local Tees Valley area. That was in the 1960s. That's 60 years ago, right? And you think the population of the Tees Valley is, I think, pushing on for 900,000 at the moment. So you go back 60 years, 100,000 people is pretty much the majority of the population, or certainly a significant chunk of it. And we've been in terminal decline since then. We haven't had the public transport investment. We haven't had the road investment, the infrastructure investment, the investment in people. That's not a political point. You can go back to the Thatcher government. You can go back to the Tony Blair government. We didn't get that investment. And the boom of the early 2000s was absolutely not felt by the local area. And so when I'm growing up and I'm seeing Tony Blair in Sedgefield and Peter Mandelson in Hartlepool and Mo Mullum in Redcar and Phil Wilson and all these other people who are in charge of the country with local Labour councils, and all of them are local MPs, and nothing changes, I just took the view politically, not ideologically, that this can't be the way of doing it, because they couldn't blame anybody else. So when I kind of got interested in politics rather than involved, I started to look at, well, what's gone wrong here? And fundamentally, what I'm trying to do now, and I have done over the last 8 years, is fix what's happened over the last 40, 50 years. So all I've done is just try to get us to the starting line and catch up the lack of investment we've had over the last 40 or 50 years. We can't compete with a Manchester or a London at the moment. We don't have the tram systems because it wasn't built 40, 50 years ago. We don't have the tube system because it wasn't built, 50, 60, 100 years ago. That infrastructure that major cities and other major conurbations take for granted and are therefore leveraging for economic growth, we don't have. So what we've got to do is spend capital in putting the infrastructure in to be able to enable the economy to succeed. We need to move away from a very insecure service sector, um, low wage economy. One of the big problems we have with the downfall of British Steel, obviously the closure of the steelworks, but also ICI that has gone into multiple ownership, the chemical cluster. The big issue we have there is that's now in multiple ownership. Great, that infrastructure is still existing, but it's all in foreign ownership. And I'd have no problem with foreign ownership, right? I'm attracting inward investment from across the world. We love it. We want it. It creates jobs. But unless it's secured in a certain way, what you find, and we saw this in 2008 with the global economic shock, a lot of these businesses will retrench back to headquarters. So branch economies like Teesside will suffer as part of the first phase of businesses and industries protecting themselves. We saw that. And we're going through another phase of it now, Simon. With the weakness of this economy, we're seeing significant numbers of chemical players, all foreign owned, pulling out of Teesside. We've seen SABIC, that are owned by the Saudis, closing down. We've seen Kellis, who are owned by Blackstone, as well as other international investors, cancelling their projects. We're seeing Ensis, who are on the brink of closure because of the lack of kind of local support and local identity. They're all retrenching back out. And if we're not careful, we might go back to where we were in the 70s and 80s, where we had that terminal decline. What I'm doing is fighting against that by bringing new investment to replace and putting the infrastructure in place that means that we can start to compete, actually not just nationally, but internationally. And what we tried to do, which is to be ambitious, is how do you pair that so that we can create some type of USP? So we're not just playing catch up. We can actually find a place where we can do things that the likes of Manchester and Liverpool and London and Birmingham can't do. And I think we found that with pivoting rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, our industrial heritage into new economies. You know, leveraging our electrical expertise, our expertise in chemicals, to move to things like carbon capture, to move to things like big power generation for things like data centers, et cetera, et cetera. So being able to pivot and do things that other parts of the country can't do, so we can create a niche that does, you know, give us a place in the world to be able to compete and be proud of.
It's a really interesting point because, as you say, branch economies get a tougher ride when times are tough. It seems like all the times are tough right now. A lot of people want a fundamentally different model. And I guess maybe this is circling back for us a little bit, but one of the ways you can have a fundamentally different model is by localizing or regionalizing the way that your economic decision making happens. That's a different way of driving investment, but it's also a different way of making decisions that could lead to a more resilient or self-sufficient way of running the economy. There's a couple of questions in the chat right now that I think are relevant to this because they're actually about the scale of your economic geography. One questioner, anonymous questioner, points out that the population of Tees Valley is less than 700,000 people. That's only 200,000 people more than what the new bill points out as being the optimized size for a unitary authority. Do you wish you had a larger population? Do you wish you had a more encompassing economic geography so that you could create more resilience with that broader base?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it blends in with another one about the merging of the Tees Valley with the rest of the Northeast, actually, as a single Northeast area. So the frank answer is no. I think the Tees Valley is a really good example of why devolution works properly. And I've spoken about this before, so apologies anybody that's listened to me before. I compare us with the one Yorkshire deal that failed. And one of the reasons the Tees Valley works, and it's one of the reasons devolution is a bit subjective, is there isn't a size that works. I'm a believer for devolution to work. There are two things you need because, again, you're talking about the buy-in, you're talking about turnout, you're talking about participation, all that kind of stuff. You need a single economic area. Well, the Tees Valley actually is, for people that know it, a relatively well-contained single economic area. Obviously, it bleeds into North Yorkshire and Durham, but actually, it is an economic area in of itself. But that's not enough to have devolution. The second part you need is a single community as well. And the Teesside area, you know, I'm born in Stockton, I'm raised in Stockton, I'm a Teessider. Okay, I'm from Stockton. You know, you go to Middlesbrough, they would say they're a Teessider. You go to Redcar, they would say they're a Teessider. In broad terms, people see themselves as a regional identity rather than an ultra local one. And again, you still have around the edges. You know, I would also say I'm a Yorkshireman. You know, others would say they're from Durham, but by and large, we have a single identity. Why are those two things important? Because when I'm having to make decisions, or the combined authority is making decisions about where to strategically spend the best investment that gives us the biggest return for the whole of the region, that does mean you're going to have to maybe spend more money in one area than another area. And we've done that, for example. The money obviously we've ploughed into Redcar is significantly more than we've spent right across the region. And we've been able to do that successfully. One, because it was the right thing to do, and we've been able to demonstrate that it's the right thing to do. But two, because I'm able to explain to people if they live in Stockton or Darlington, that's an investment in them. Even though it's in Redcar, which might be half an hour to 40 minutes away, they see it as an investment in them because the economy means that they travel and commute to work and they say, okay, I live in Darlington, but that is actually for me and my children as well. If you compare that to One Yorkshire, if I was, Darlington Station, sorry, I'd go off on piste again. We've invested 140 million quid in Darlington Station. Everybody across the region think that's a great thing because everybody uses Darlington Station to go to Edinburgh, London, 2.5 hours to London on the train. Great investment, everybody loves it. If I was the mayor of Yorkshire and tried to do the same thing in Northallerton on the East Coast Main Line and say, I'm going to build a state-of-the-art Darlington style, London King's Cross style station in Northallerton, I'm going to spend 200 million quid, isn't this great? I guarantee you the first thing that would happen politically is the people of Bradford or Sheffield or Leeds would say, well, where's our 200 million pound station? Why aren't you investing that in us? Because one, people wouldn't be able to identify it as an investment in them because it's not their economy. They don't necessarily commute on those distances. And two, the people of Northallerton don't feel like they're the same community of the people of Bradford or Sheffield. They're different communities, so they don't see that as an investment in themselves. So I think I think those two things are absolutely essential. And the Tees Valley has both of those things. So the size is the size, and it works, and it's nimble, and we're able to affect that change and get buy-in because of that. I actually think the Northeast is going to be really interesting to see because, again, I personally think the Northeast Combined Authority is too big an area. I don't believe the people of Teesdale, which border Teesside, feel like they are the same community as the people of Sunderland or Newcastle. And I think you found one of the reasons the rest of the Northeast struggled to get a devolution deal in the first place was because there was never a meeting of minds of the leaders that they could come together collectively and agree a deal. To be frank, I believe, and I don't know this to be true, but I'm fairly confident I'm right, the only reason a deal did get done in the Northeast is because they saw other areas of the country getting money and priority, and they basically held their nose and said, oh, let's get through the door and see what happens. But that's not going to end well because they're not a single community. They're not going to be able to come up with a plan where you're ploughing hundreds of millions of pounds into Durham because what are Tynemouth going to say? Well, where's our money? And that's a very difficult thing, particularly as a mayor, to be able to keep people on board and drive towards a destination that you're trying to take a region on when people are pulling in different directions.
That sounds like a description of the very idea that a devolution deal could be done because people feel like they're missing out on some important selection of powers. No, that sounds very plausible to me. I think there's a point you just made that I think is important here, which is that the geography is self-defined during the kind of deal-making phase of devolution, if I can describe it like that, because it was about where you could find enough local consensus between the relevant authorities to want to come together to do a combined authority. This is where politics starts kicking in again, right? So that was clearly the case across Tees Valley. You are in a position now where your board, where your constituent authorities, well, I mean, whatever else they are, they're not conservative controlled. I think that all but one of them are now Labour majority and one's no overall control of the Labour lead or something like that. I might have lost track. So what's that like? You've gotten quite a lot done, as we've just been saying, in a context where you must have to navigate, and I guess mayors have to do this consistently, to transcend political difference on almost a daily basis. What's the secret for that?
Yeah, so just very quickly before I answer that, I think the Tees Valley is also an interesting example because when James was negotiating the deal, the only reason the five Labour leaders at the time agreed to the deal is because one, they wanted the money, and two, they were obviously going to win the election. And actually, one of the local leaders was my opponent in the election because she was going to step down from being the leader of her council, become the mayor, and they'd slid somebody else in. Had they known the outcome of that election, I obviously guarantee, and I'm sure people would accept this, I guarantee you they would not have agreed to that deal. So there is a lot of politics, and we're seeing that play out more now. So if you look at places like Cumbria with the delay of the election, the Lib Dems over there have been playing silly buggers for a long time because they don't think they can win on a regional level. And they think if there was, say, a Tory mayor, it will cause them a problem in local elections. So they're kind of standing out against it, trying to frustrate. Obviously, the government with where they're at the minute don't want elections because they know they're going to get hammered all over the place. So the deferment of the Cumbria election, for instance, for me is just politicking beyond belief. I think that is unfair, and we're seeing that play out now. But when I got through the door, so the way it's worked for me, when I was elected in 2017, I had 5 Labour leaders. Then there was a local election in 2019 where we had 1 Labour leader, 3 independents, and 1 Tory leader who made up my board, my cabinet. And then after the most recent local elections, we now have 5 Labour leaders again. The interesting statistic, which is God's honest truth, and anybody can go away and research this if they've got the time, but ever since I was elected in 2017, we have never taken a single decision to my cabinet for approval that has not been agreed unanimously. Ever. We've never had anybody vote against a single thing that we've taken forward. And the reason for that actually is we generally do get on, and actually the Labour leaders are by and large pretty constructive in making sure that we do the best for the region, despite them being more focused on their local area. For the large part of it, they are quite good at prioritising the region when they come to the combined authority to make decisions rather than being too parochial. But the other reason we do it is because people don't see the amount of effort and work that goes in behind the scenes. That means that actually a lot of our decision-making processes are formalities, because a huge amount of negotiation, discussion, change, compromise happens months in advance before anything even gets close to a formal cabinet process and decision. And I'm quite proud of that, and I'm quite proud of the team that we have at the combined authority who work with their local authority counterparts at officer level and the politicians who engage in that have meant that we have taken some pretty big and bold decisions, and we've done it on a collective basis. And it's also really interesting that, I appreciate it and I get it, so I don't mind, but I get a lot of flack and I get a lot of personal blame for things that people don't like. And again, what most people don't realize, and certainly a lot of local people in Teesside don't realize, that there are actually very few things at the moment that I can do without getting the agreement of the local leaders. And so it is often a collective agreement. Now, that is changing in the new devolution bill. And interestingly, it's not because I asked for it, because I actually get on pretty well with the local Labour leaders. And I suspect after the next local elections, we won't have many local Labour leaders left, and who knows what we'll have. But it's actually been in the last 12 months, it's been the Labour mayors who have been desperate to make the changes to get more mayoral powers, because they actually struggle with some of their own colleagues to be able to push things through their cabinet. So it's not sometimes about political opposition. Sometimes there are frictions within parties that stop things from getting through. And there's definitely a push under this government, not entirely, but by and large, to move towards more mayoral powers that the mayor can give themselves rather than having to go through the board or cabinet of the combined authority.
It's interesting because I guess with my kind of my social science hat on, the fact that you've done everything you've done with unanimity behind it, not only because it's important to proceed on that basis, but because there's a structural reason that's changing now as mayoral powers start to be increased. But that tells me that there's probably like a list in the back of your head somewhere of things that you might have loved to have a crack at, but you thought, I'll never get this past the board. What's on that list?
Yeah. I genuinely say this, Simon. All of the major things that I've wanted to do since being elected mayor, and obviously there's politicking, there's cajoling, there's obviously the public PR battle that you have as well to be able to position people. So there's a lot of positioning people to, sometimes put them in a position where they can't vote against something. Sometimes it's compromise, sometimes it's horse trading. I think collectively, locally, we've been very good at managing that process for the big things. There are some really cool, I think, quite exciting little things that we've done. There's mayoral challenges that I tried to set up back in 2018 that we were going to do around frictionless trade. We did it with public. We were going to do some really exciting stuff around blockchain. We were going to do some stuff around digital trade long before it was cool and interesting. And unfortunately, we just couldn't get that through, so it never materialized. And so that went by the wayside. Interestingly, we did end up slightly delivering it in a different way, in that we then created the free port policy for the then Conservative government. They set up the free ports. We got one. And actually, through the free port, we're now setting up the UK's National Digital Trade Centre, working with the HMRC, and we've got some digital trade things. So I often tend to find I get my own way anyway. I think one of the things I would have liked sooner, but again, we've managed it, so it's been fine, is I would have liked the planning powers sooner. I think the ability for a mayor, both from an accountability point of view, but a progress point of view, would really help to be able to progress things more quickly. So I think we'd still end up getting to where we got to today, but we could have maybe got there a little bit quicker. And I think where the government are getting to at the minute is frustrating, even for the planning powers, because they're talking now about by the time it goes through Parliament and the SIs are laid for each of the orders or each of the mayoral areas, we're probably not going to get those powers until next July, maybe even next September. I mean, that's a huge delay when this government needs growth and it needs to improve the economy. Mayors can do that with those types of powers. And my worry at the minute is they still haven't defined what kind of powers the mayor's going to get. So we were expecting them to reflect the London mayoral call-in powers and planning powers and mayoral development orders. But some of the briefing that we're seeing over the last couple of weeks are that they might set quite a high bar. So they might only want us to interfere with planning applications, for instance, where there's more than 200 dwellings being proposed, or what does that mean for infrastructure? Because there's a whole lot of infrastructure. There's a couple of big road schemes, for instance, that I think we could design to go through the local planning process rather than a DCO, and I'd sign it off within 12 weeks on the basis that it was a sound planning application. We wouldn't be waiting years for that to happen. But again, is that going to be out of scope? So I'm a bit worried with this government that they've come up with the right idea. And to be frank to them, they've said a lot of good things since they got into power in the last 12 months. But then what actually materializes out of it tends to be the polar opposite. And I'm worried with the planning stuff. They've got the right idea and they've got it in the bill. But what's going to materialize through that process is going to be a really damp squib. And I just hope they hold their nose and stick to it and force it through. Because you can make some serious changes. Having said that, to play devil's advocate, where you get the wrong type of mayor, who might be a little bit too influenced by the local politics and not necessarily have I have a very clear laser focused view of what I think is right. And I'll take it on the chin and I'll explain it to local people while I'm making decisions. But another mayor might actually say, well, we're going to stop developing because we're anti-development, or we want to get votes in a local village, or whatever it might be. So with that type of power, there's going to be big swings across the country. You're going to have pro-development mayors, you're going to have anti-development mayors. But my argument would be there's a level of competition being introduced into the public sector there where businesses and people will have a choice about what type of environment they want to live in.
I think isn't that part and parcel of actually taking devolution seriously, is the idea that a local leader might not align with what you think the right priority is, and you've got to lump it. And if it doesn't work, they'll learn that lesson pretty quick, and the results are the result.
Elections, right? That comes down to elections, and what people decide is: are they happy with the anti-development mayor, or do they want somebody who's more pro-growth, pro-housing? That's absolutely fine. That's what democracy is. But this is where we come full circle back to fiscal devolution. And again, what I see, if it was, if I was to wave a magic wand and be in charge, I would, at this moment in time, my view is I would go to a much more federalized system. I did propose when we first had the powers, when we were setting up the free ports, we were talking about full devolution of income tax, corporation tax. You might want to have a journey where you don't necessarily devolve those things on day one, but you might start with income tax or corporation tax. You might start with a local sales tax. I think there's something you've got to start on a journey, and I think that would be really powerful, because then you'd have other regions competing with each other, and they try and put on what they believe to the public and to investors what would be the most appealing set of circumstances. And again, somebody might have a view that that's higher taxation with more public services and public transport and more intervention. And maybe somebody like myself might say, well, actually, I'd massively slash taxes and go for growth and allow the private sector to pile in and invest their money rather than the taxpayers' money. I mean, but at the moment we don't have that choice, and therefore I don't think voters have that choice. They've got a halfway house on devolution at the minute. But that's whether you get there over 20 or 30 years. It goes back to my original point: is where do we want devolution to go? Because if it could stay like this for the next however many years, and it would just bumble along, and it would do a few nice bits and pieces, but it wouldn't really achieve what it could achieve.
It does feel like we're at a point now where it could easily plateau, or it could even start to kind of retrench and get less ambitious over time if the results aren't seen in all the places and in all the ways that people expect. So I think that's interesting.
It's already going to plateau. So we've got the devolution bill going through. That's clearly this government's pitch on devolution, which is fine. I'm not against it. I think it's a decent bill with in the most part. So we're not going to see more devolution this parliament. So the interesting thing is who forms the next parliament and what's the future view of devolution? That's the key question for devolution, because you're right, it can go backwards, it can plateau, or let's say there is a world in which a Conservative Party get back in. You might smirk at that and probably be right to, but let's say you did. I could see a Conservative Party completely ripping up the way that the state works. And I think people in 3 or 4 years' time will be looking at that. You could see a reform government do that. The abolition of quangos, I think, is a huge issue for growth and deregulation that's needed in this country. Well, if you still wanted some level of democratic oversight of that, that doesn't have to go to ministers. That could come to the regional mayors. We don't need Homes England. Homes England doesn't need to exist. It's a funding body for us. We could take all of the money from Homes England, just divide it up and give us the responsibility. I know colleagues have talked about the Arts Council saying similar things. You could do, there's a whole load of quangos that you could do. And actually, you would wire devolution so they, in effect, become regional departments. And they would then have to bid into the budget like any other government department, and they would have a direct relationship with the Treasury. Whereas at the minute, we don't. We have relationships with departments, and then second hand, we have to then feed up to the Treasury. I could see a model like that appearing that would be hugely powerful, but that would change politics and the way that the state works in this country pretty drastically. And obviously, that would have to be thought through about what the consequences might be. But that's a version that you could easily see emerge over the next 5 or 10 years.
We're nearly out of time, but I don't know if this will surprise you or not. Maybe you've had this conversation, but this is an area where I think you are in total alignment with Mayor Andy Burnham, where his narrative almost now is to say, look, all of these ALBs, they're not doing the business. Actually, what you should be thinking about is what it looks like to have a regionalized delivery model, and the appropriate institutional architecture for that is the combined authority. It's what's going to be called the strategic authority. Sounds like you're on board with that, but then we get back to mission creep a little bit, don't we? And I should say we just published a report advocating for the devolution of Homes England, so we're on the same page there too.
There you go. Great minds think alike.
We maybe have time for like one last very quick question. Can I ask you about, you mentioned inter-regional competition as being one potential outcome from fiscal devolution. There's quite a lot of talk right now, when we're talking about scale in particular, about the importance of inter-regional collaboration. There's the Greater North. You've also got stuff happening across the Midlands. You've got stuff happening across Yorkshire. Where do you see the role of that inter-mayor collaboration, both within those specific arrangements, but also more broadly? What's it like sitting around that table at the Council of Nations and Regions?
Yeah, it's fine. I think, again, my view may be slightly different to others in that I think collaboration between regions can be a good thing, but I think it needs to be organic and it needs to be done on an informal basis because there are reasons why I might partner with Andy Burnham on a specific issue, or there might be a reason I partner with Kim in the rest of the Northeast. But the idea that we need, it's one of the reasons I was always frustrated with Transport for the North, because Transport for the North kind of formalized something that didn't need to be overly formalized. Because when you formalize those types of relationships, you create power bases. And this isn't Andy's fault, and it's not Manchester's fault, but it is true to say the Transport for the North was basically it was a Manchester thing, and it still is a Manchester thing. It's obsessed with HS2. It's obsessed with the Northern Powerhouse rail line, but actually what they're obsessed with is Manchester to Leeds. And I speak to local government colleagues in Yorkshire, the rest of the Northeast, and some other mayors across the North that might not go on record, who get pretty frustrated that things like the rail stuff in the North is very Manchester focused, but it would be right because Manchester is basically the UK's second city. So you can see how that you would get that. And again, going back to the question that somebody asked, the Tees Valley, in my personal opinion, should never merge with the rest of the Northeast because we had an old regional development agency that covered the Northeast and it only cared about Newcastle. Teesside was an afterthought because that's where the power base was, that's where the politics was. So I think you've got to be really careful about these formal structures because what you actually end up doing is moving power away from local areas to subnational government bodies, or even if it's arm's length government bodies set up like the Great North or whatever it might be, that actually takes power and control away from local areas. So I think it's got to be an organic, informal process rather than a formal one. To be fair, the Great North is that. There's no law or formal structure to it, but we've agreed to come together and think there will be things that we should be working on collectively. And the obvious one that we're starting out with is inward investment. Being able to go across the world and pitch the North on a global scale is powerful. And we've all got different unique strengths. That means that we're not losing out to Manchester or anywhere else. There's a collective strength to that. But if all of a sudden it starts to become formalized and governments start to recognize it as a thing, and then they want to kind of enshrine it, then it becomes a beast in itself. And that's when it starts to suck in power and resource. And that for me is anti-devolution, right? The whole purpose of devolution is bring powers down to the appropriate level. Don't bring them down to a level and then give them back up to a different level. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
You'll have seen we're already out of time. Somehow we've had I selfishly, I will say I've had a fantastic time in this conversation. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. Really interesting insight and perspective on all of them. And we'd love to have you back on or to do other things with you in the future. Thank you so much, Ben Houchen. To everyone still tuned in and listening later online, our next event is going to be with Andrea Jenkins, and we're doing that in a couple of weeks' time. So do lock into that. It'll be another really interesting perspective, I'm sure. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks again to our special guest, Mayor of the Tees Valley, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you.